What if the Book of Enoch isn't only a story about angels? What if buried inside its visions is something far stranger? A record of beings and creatures that were never supposed to exist alongside humanity? Enoch describes heavenly beings descending to earth. He describes the Watchers crossing the boundary between heaven and the human world. He describes giants born from their union with human women. And then, in one of the strangest visions in the entire book, Enoch sees something almost impossible to interpret. Animals begin producing creatures that don't belong to the normal order of nature. Elephants, camels, asses. But these aren't simply animals appearing in a dream. They emerge after mysterious stars descend from heaven and take their place among the creatures of earth. And that's where the story becomes disturbing. Because Enoch's visions repeatedly blur the boundary between heaven, earth, and creatures that seem to belong somewhere in between. But there's an even stranger account. Enoch is shown two enormous beings separated from each other at the beginning of creation. One belongs to the depths of the ocean. The other occupies a vast wilderness on dry land. Their names are Leviathan and Behemoth. And Enoch doesn't describe them as ordinary animals. He calls them monsters. Leviathan is placed over the fountains of the deep. Behemoth is assigned to a wilderness east of the garden where the righteous will dwell. And when Enoch asks the angel to show him their power, the angel gives him an answer that sounds almost like a warning. You desire to know what is hidden. Hidden. That's the word we need to remember. Because Enoch's entire journey is about things humanity isn't supposed to see. The hidden places of heaven. The fallen watchers. The secrets they taught humanity. The giants they produced. And creatures that appear outside the normal boundaries of creation. But here's the question that will take us through this entire investigation. Were these beings simply visions and symbols? Or did Enoch believe he was being shown real creatures that existed somewhere in the ancient world? And if some of them were confined, what happened to the one that was never completely removed from Earth? If you enjoy uncovering the strange creatures and forgotten beings hidden inside ancient texts, subscribe to the 9th tablet, because this channel is where we open the passages most people never hear about. And we're starting with the beings that changed humanity forever. The Watchers. Because before Enoch describes the monsters, before he describes the strange creatures, there were beings from heaven who came down to earth. And according to Enoch, they didn't come here to observe humanity. They came here to change it. Before Enoch ever describes strange creatures, he describes something even more disturbing. Beings from heaven who came down to earth. The Book of Enoch says that the Watchers looked upon the daughters of men and decided to take human wives. They descended together to Mount Hermon, where they swore an oath to carry out what they had planned. There were 200 of them. And they didn't simply come to observe humanity. They began teaching humanity things the text describes as forbidden knowledge. Sorcery. Enchantments. The secrets of plants and roots. The observation of the stars. The movements of the sun and moon. And the working of metals and weapons. But then something happened that changed the story completely. The women conceived. And they gave birth to giants. Enoch describes these beings as enormous. So enormous that they could consume what human beings produced faster than humanity could provide it. Eventually, the giants turned against humanity itself. And then the story gets even stranger. Enoch says the giants didn't limit their violence to humans. They began attacking birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish. They consumed flesh. They drank blood. And the earth itself is said to have brought an accusation against them. Now stop and think about what Enoch is actually describing. This isn't simply a story about fallen angels. It's a story about a corruption of the natural order. Heavenly beings cross into the human world. They produce offspring that Enoch portrays as unnatural and destructive. And those beings begin affecting the entire animal world. Which raises a fascinating question. Were the giants the only strange beings produced by this rebellion? Because later in the Enochic tradition, we encounter something even stranger. The text describes the spirits that came from the giants after their destruction as evil spirits dwelling on earth. They are said to attack, oppress, and trouble humanity even after the giants themselves are gone. So according to Enoch's story, the Watchers didn't simply leave behind ruins. They left behind a legacy of beings. Flesh and spirit. Giants and evil spirits. And a world that had been permanently changed. But there's something else hiding in this account. Enoch says the Watchers revealed secret things that had been preserved in heaven. And that phrase may be the key to understanding why the author connects the Watchers with the corruption of earth. They didn't just bring themselves. They brought knowledge. And once humanity received that knowledge, there was no simply putting it back. If you're enjoying these investigations into the strange beings and forgotten stories inside the ancient texts, subscribe to the 9th tablet. because the Watchers are only the beginning. Enoch eventually describes creatures that are far harder to classify than giants. Creatures that appear in a vision involving stars, animals, and strange transformations. And that's where this story moves from fallen beings to something that sounds almost impossible. A world where the boundaries between different kinds of life begin to collapse. This is where Enoch's vision becomes truly bizarre. Because he doesn't simply see fallen stars coming down from heaven. He sees them entering the animal world. In chapter 86, Enoch looks toward heaven and sees a star fall. Then more stars descend. But when they reach earth, something changes. They appear among the cattle as bulls. And then Enoch watches as these strange beings mate with the cattle. The result? Elephants, camels, and asses. Read that again. Elephants, camels, and asses. They're not described as ordinary offspring. The vision presents them as the result of a supernatural intrusion into the natural order. And the consequences are immediate. The cattle become terrified. The creatures begin attacking and devouring them. And Enoch says that the people of the earth begin to tremble and flee. This is one of the strangest passages in the entire Book of Enoch. But there's an important detail we need to understand. Enoch isn't necessarily giving us a literal zoological catalog. This is part of what scholars call the animal apocalypse, where human history and the Watchers' rebellion are represented through animals and stars. The strange creatures are part of a symbolic vision. But that doesn't make the passage less interesting. Because within the story, Enoch is showing something very specific. The boundaries between heaven, earth, and creation have been violated. The stars come down. They take earthly form. They enter the animal world. And their offspring don't belong neatly to the categories that existed before. And if you're fascinated by these strange passages in ancient texts, subscribe to the 9th tablet, because this is exactly the kind of material we're here to investigate. But here's where things become even stranger. Enoch doesn't simply watch these creatures appear. He is taken to a high place. And the heavenly beings tell him to remain there so he can witness what happens to the elephants, camels, asses, cattle, and the fallen stars. That means Enoch isn't merely having a random nightmare. Within the narrative, he's being given a guided vision. He's being told, watch what happens next. And what happens next is horrifying. The creatures begin turning against one another. The earth itself cries out. And then heavenly beings arrive. They seize the fallen stars. They bind them. And the strange creatures are eventually destroyed. So whatever Enoch intended these creatures to represent, they don't remain forever. The rebellion is contained. The corrupt beings are punished. The monstrous offspring are destroyed. But that creates a much bigger question. If these creatures were destroyed, why does Enoch continue to describe other enormous beings that remain hidden on earth? Because the next creature he introduces doesn't come from the stars. It doesn't come from the Watchers. And it isn't described as a hybrid. It is something far older. Something enormous. Something assigned a place on earth from the beginning of creation. Its name is one you've probably heard before. Behemoth. And its counterpart lives somewhere even more mysterious. Leviathan. That's where Enoch's catalog of strange creatures takes an entirely different turn. After showing Enoch the strange creatures connected with the fallen stars, the vision takes an unexpected turn. Because now Enoch is shown two beings that are completely different. They aren't described as offspring of the Watchers. They aren't introduced as hybrids. And they aren't presented as ordinary animals. Enoch calls them monsters. Their names are Leviathan and Behemoth. But here's the detail that makes this passage so strange. Enoch says they were separated from one another. Leviathan is female and is placed in the depths of the sea, above the fountains of the waters. The Behemoth is male and occupies a vast wilderness called Duodain, east of the garden where the righteous will eventually dwell. And Enoch immediately asks the question any of us would ask. How powerful are these creatures? He wants to see their might. He wants to understand what they are. And the angel responds with a sentence that almost sounds like a warning. You desire to know what is hidden. Think about what Enoch has already been shown. The Watchers, the giants, the secrets of heaven, the strange creatures connected with the fallen stars. And now, two primordial monsters hidden in completely different parts of creation. But there is something extremely important here. Enoch does not say that Leviathan and Behemoth are evil. He doesn't identify them as fallen angels. He doesn't say they escaped from the Watchers. Instead, the text presents them as creatures that God has separated and assigned specific places. That distinction matters. Because later traditions often transformed Leviathan into something resembling a cosmic dragon or symbol of evil. But Enoch's account is more mysterious. These creatures are part of the architecture of creation itself. They're enormous, they're hidden, they're under divine control, and they're being preserved for a specific moment in the future. Because later in the same chapter, Enoch is told that these two monsters have been prepared for an appointed purpose connected with the final judgment and the banquet of the righteous. So suddenly our question changes. We began by asking, what creatures visited Earth? But Enoch has now shown us something stranger. Some creatures didn't need to visit Earth. They were already part of the world, hidden in places humanity could barely reach. And that raises the central mystery of this entire investigation. If Leviathan is beneath the waters, and Behemoth is hidden in the wilderness, are they still there? Did Enoch believe these beings survived? Or were they waiting for a specific moment when God would finally release them? Because Enoch's next revelations move from creatures to the secrets of the entire natural world. He begins seeing storehouses of wind, places where snow and frost are kept, the divisions of the stars, the foundations of heaven, and the hidden mechanisms governing the earth. It is as if Enoch is being shown what humanity sees on the surface is only a fraction of what actually exists. And if you're enjoying this exploration of the strange beings and hidden creatures described in ancient texts, subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because we're about to reach the most mysterious creature in this entire story. Not the Watchers, not the giants, not even Leviathan. Something that Enoch says survives in the world of spirits long after the giants themselves are destroyed. And that may finally explain what the titles, One That Never Left, is really pointing toward. Now we need to separate two things Enoch actually says from the mystery we're building around them. The strange creatures connected with the fallen stars do not simply remain wandering across the earth forever. The Watchers are judged. The giants are destroyed. And Enoch says something extraordinary happens after the giants die. Their bodies disappear, but their spirits remain. Enoch explains that the giants, born from the union of the Watchers and human women, become what he calls evil spirits upon the earth. Their origin is connected to both the Watchers and humanity, but their dwelling is now on earth. And then Enoch gives them a terrifying purpose. These spirits are said to afflict, oppress, attack, and cause destruction among human beings. They don't simply vanish when the giants are killed. Their physical existence ends, but something from them remains. And this is one of the most important distinctions in the entire Book of Enoch. The giants are not the same thing as the spirits that come from them. The body dies. The spirit continues. And according to Enoch, those spirits remain active until the Great Judgment. So when people talk about the strange beings that Enoch describes, they're sometimes mixing together several completely different categories. The Watchers are one category. The giants are another. And the spirits of the giants are another. 3 stages. 1 rebellion. And suddenly the title's final mystery becomes much more interesting. Because perhaps the one that never left isn't a giant walking around somewhere in the modern world. Perhaps it's something much harder to see. A spirit. A being without a physical body. Something that Enoch says came from the destruction of the giants and continued operating on earth afterward. And notice how Enoch describes them. They don't need food. They don't live like human beings. They don't simply reproduce. They exist to afflict and trouble humanity. That means the flood didn't necessarily end everything connected to the Watchers. The physical giants could be destroyed, while their spirits remained. And this creates an extraordinary connection between the ancient story and the later tradition of evil spirits and demons. Enoch isn't using modern categories. But within his own worldview, these spirits are beings associated with the rebellion of the Watchers and the violence of the giants. And they remain on earth until judgment. So if you're enjoying this exploration of the beings hidden inside the Book of Enoch, subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because we're about to confront the most important question yet. If the giants were destroyed, if the Watchers were imprisoned, and if the spirits of the giants continued on earth, what exactly happens to them at the end? Because Enoch doesn't leave them here forever. He gives them an expiration date. Great Judgment. And when that judgment arrives, the last remnants of the Watchers' rebellion finally face the consequences of what they brought into the world. But Enoch doesn't leave these spirits wandering forever. There is a deadline. A moment when the rebellion that began in heaven finally reaches its end. Judgment. Chapter 16 says that the spirits that came from the bodies of the giants would continue their destructive activity until the Great Judgment, the moment when the age itself reaches its appointed consummation. And notice what this means. The giants die. Their flesh perishes. But their spirits continue. The Watchers are imprisoned. The spirits of the giants remain on earth. And yet neither group is beyond the reach of the final judgment. Enoch's vision is building toward a moment when every remnant of that ancient rebellion is finally dealt with. The Watchers themselves are told that they will have no peace. Why? Because they crossed a boundary. They came from heaven. They knew mysteries that had not been given to humanity, and they deliberately revealed those mysteries to human beings. That is the pattern running through the entire story. Forbidden knowledge, forbidden union, forbidden offspring, and eventually, forbidden spirits remaining on earth. But there is something fascinating about the way Enoch describes the spirits of the giants. They don't behave like physical creatures. They don't eat ordinary food. They aren't described as needing physical bodies. They are invisible, yet they can afflict and attack human beings. So perhaps the most enduring thing produced by the Watchers wasn't the giant itself. It was what survived after the giant was gone. And that brings us back to the mystery we started with. The creatures connected with the fallen stars? They were destroyed. The giants? Their bodies perished. The Watchers? They were imprisoned and await judgment. But the spirits that came from the giants? Enoch says they remained on earth until the final judgment. That is the closest the text itself comes to giving us a being that never left. Not a physical monster hiding in a forest. Not a giant secretly walking among modern humanity. Something much more unsettling. An invisible presence left behind by an ancient rebellion. And if you're enjoying these investigations into the strange beings hidden inside ancient texts, subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because there's still one creature we haven't fully confronted. The creature Enoch places in the sea. The creature he places in the wilderness. The creature he calls a monster. And says I was prepared for the future. Leviathan. And when we follow that creature through Enoch's vision, we discover something that makes the question of whether these beings ever truly disappeared even harder to answer. But there is a problem with the story we've been telling. If the strange creatures of the Watchers' rebellion were destroyed, the giants died. And if the spirits that came from them were merely waiting for judgment, what about Leviathan? Because Enoch describes Leviathan differently. He doesn't say Leviathan was born from the Watchers. He doesn't say Leviathan was one of the giants. And he doesn't describe her as an evil spirit. Instead, Enoch places her in the depths of the ocean, above the fountains of the waters. Behemoth, her male counterpart, is placed on dry land in a wilderness east of the garden where the righteous will dwell. And here's the detail that makes this so fascinating. Enoch says they were separated on a specific day. They weren't creatures that humanity accidentally discovered. They were deliberately placed apart. And when Enoch asks the angel to show him their power, the angel responds that he is trying to discover something hidden. Think about the implication. Enoch has already seen the Watchers violate the boundary between heaven and earth. Now he's being shown creatures that belong to an entirely different category. Creatures hidden in places humanity cannot easily reach. One beneath the ocean. One in an enormous wilderness. And neither is presented as something humanity can simply hunt down and destroy. But there's an even bigger twist. Later in the same chapter, the story connects these two monsters with the future. They have been prepared for an appointed time connected with judgment. So Enoch isn't simply describing creatures that existed in the past. He's describing creatures whose story apparently continues into the future. And suddenly our title becomes much more complicated. The one that never left. Maybe it isn't claiming that some giant creature is secretly walking around modern Earth. Maybe the ancient text is pointing toward something that was never destroyed in the first place. Something placed somewhere beyond ordinary human reach. Waiting for an appointed moment. And that is very different from the Watchers. The Watchers were imprisoned. The giants were destroyed. Their spirits remained. But Leviathan? Leviathan was preserved. And Enoch gives no indication that she simply vanished. In fact, the text places her within the architecture of the final events themselves. That makes Leviathan one of the strangest beings in Enoch's entire cosmology. Not a fallen angel. Not a giant. Not a human. Not an ordinary animal. A monster deliberately separated from its counterpart and preserved for the appointed time. And if you're enjoying these investigations into the creatures and beings hidden inside ancient texts, subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because we're now approaching the question that could completely change how you understand the title. What exactly does Enoch mean by a creature that never left? Is it a physical being? A symbol? An ancient memory of something real? Or is the one that never left actually something much more disturbing? Something that doesn't need a body at all? Because when we put the Watchers, the giants, their spirits, Leviathan, and Behemoth side by side, one category stands apart from everything else. And that's where Enoch's final mystery begins. So after everything Enoch has shown us, we can finally return to the title. the beings that came from heaven, the Watchers, the giants, the strange creatures in the animal apocalypse, the evil spirits that remained after the giants were destroyed, Leviathan, Behemoth. They are not one single category. And that's important because Enoch never actually gives us a modern scientific list of species that visited Earth. What he gives us is something much stranger, a vision of creation populated by heavenly beings, earthly creatures, hybrid figures, monsters, and spirits operating across different realms. But among all of them, one group stands out: the spirits of the giants. Because Enoch says that when the giants die, their spirits come out from their bodies and become evil spirits upon the earth. Their dwelling is on earth, and they continue to afflict, oppress, attack, and cause destruction. And then Enoch gives us the most important detail. They remain until the Great Judgment. Their existence is not described as permanent. Their activity has an appointed end. But until that day, they remain. That means the one that never left isn't necessarily a physical creature hiding somewhere beneath the ocean or inside an unexplored forest. The strongest reading supported by Enoch itself is much more unsettling. Something from the ancient rebellion remained after the bodies were gone. The giants died, but their spirits remained. The Watchers were imprisoned, but their consequences remained. And the knowledge they revealed had already spread throughout humanity. The rebellion was over, but its aftermath continued. And perhaps that's why Enoch's story is ultimately less about monsters than it is about boundaries. Heaven had a boundary. Earth had a boundary. Humanity had a boundary. The Watchers crossed it. The giants were born from that violation. The spirits remained after their bodies disappeared. And the entire story moves toward a final judgment in which those beings, and the godless, are finally dealt with. Even Leviathan and Behemoth are not presented as random monsters roaming freely across the world. Enoch places them in specific realms and describes them within a vision concerned with the hidden structure of creation and the coming judgment. So perhaps the most terrifying thing Enoch saw wasn't a creature with enormous teeth. It was the realization that some things can disappear physically without disappearing completely. A body can die. A kingdom can fall. A watcher can be imprisoned. A giant can be destroyed. But the consequences of what happened can remain. And that's where Enoch leaves us. Not with proof that some ancient species is secretly walking among us today. The text doesn't give us that. It leaves us with something more mysterious. An ancient world in which the boundaries between heaven, earth, flesh, and spirit were crossed, and in which some consequences continued long after the original beings were gone. If you want more investigations into the strange beings, hidden realms, watchers, Nephilim, ancient manuscripts, and mysteries buried inside the Book of Enoch, subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because we've only opened one part of Enoch's world. And the next question may be even stranger. If Enoch was shown beings that lived before the flood, what did he see when he was taken beyond the boundaries of Earth itself? What was waiting in the places no human being was supposed to see? That's where we go next.